Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you. My name is David Callaway. I'm the founder and editor of Callaway Climate Insights. It's a 2-year-old climate newsletter dedicated to climate investing and solutions. I'm the former editor of USA Today, MarketWatch, a bunch of other news organizations, and like a lot of the media, trying to get in and help the media try to tell the story of what all these people on stage are doing, which is fascinating. And I've had a great time learning about it and look forward to learning a lot more. Now, thrilling to be back in a live setting after a couple of years of being locked up. I had to run by a couple rules of my. Remember, when you're in a live setting, don't trip on the stage when you get up, don't swear, and now, of course, don't get smacked if you say something stupid by an audience. I'll try to do my best, and any one of you guys who wants to come up and smack me, a little entertainment, please feel free. Anyway, we've got a huge panel.
Yeah.
No Oscars. They generally say that you should not have more than 3 people on your panel. We have 8 and 30 minutes. So by my calculations, that's about 3 minutes for everyone to say something. I'm just about done, and I'm going to let these guys go at it. But let me introduce the group first. I'll just go in order of the list. Diawara, who we heard up from the last panel from Lowercarbon Capital. Maddie Hall from Living Carbon. We heard from her earlier this morning. Davida Herzl from Aclima. Hello, Davida. Welcome. James Newsome from Persefoni. We heard from you this morning as well. Sarah Richardson from MicroByre. Hello, Sarah. Heather Toney from EDF. Manik Suri from Therma. And Avra Vanderzee from Elemental, who we heard from on the last discussion. I thought Mia and Avra, that the last discussion was really fascinating and focused a lot on kind of the hopes and optimism. And David started it out with an interesting question, saying kind of what's changed between now and climate tech, clean tech 1.0, right? I'm gonna hit you with a little bit more of a different question. I'd like to know, and I'm gonna hit somebody who hasn't spoken yet. So James, let's start with you. What's changed since December in terms of climate investing? The world has been flipped on its head. There's suddenly a mad scramble for fossil fuels, at least among some of the major governments. And even before Putin invaded Ukraine, the markets had turned lower, and we were hearing stories about venture lenders cutting back, adding restrictions to their lending, cutting back on lending for entrepreneurs and startups. What's changed, and is it just a short-term thing?
That's a good question. Not an expert when it comes to politics and the policies that goes across that, but I can tell you one thing that's changed. Last week changed a lot in regards to the SEC proposal that came out. It finally gave that clarity that I think the market was looking for. When we started, when Persefoni started in 2020 in January, our thesis was on getting that clarity from SEC from a regulation standpoint, and that's why we built the system in the way we built it. In regards to investors, I will pass it to one of the investors on stage to probably speak more in depth to that question.
All right, anyone else want to take that question? Change since the Ukraine war started?
I have them. Okay, well, now I'm talking, so I guess I'll answer. Yeah, I mean, it just has solidified the need to move off reliance. I mean, now, we always knew this, but now in addition to it being, a social justice issue and a life issue, it's also a security issue. So I think the momentum around moving off reliance on foreign fuel and fossil fuels is even more, it's stronger than ever. So I just feel even more that the momentum is moving in the right direction.
Does anyone think, though, that the amount of money that's been flowing into climate solutions in the last couple of years, we heard about the $7 billion from TPG this morning, could get pulled back if suddenly there's fossil fuels are alive and well, and they're going to be needed money coming from JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Wells Fargo and all the lenders? Is that going to affect the amount of money going into renewables, for instance? Sure, Heather.
I would say no. I think if anything, what we're seeing right now is, as Avra was saying, it's a commitment. This is one of the places where you see large groups, large green groups like EDF align with environmental justice groups, because we do agree that we have to focus on renewables now more than ever. In addition to that, there's a tremendous amount of money from the federal government that has already been released. And so leveraging those funds, makes more sense than letting them go to waste. So it's very important, I think, for investors to recognize that this money is already on the ground. It's already been used in cities, and there's already a plan of action for that. So it would be in our best interests to truly leverage what's out there as opposed to going backwards.
That's a good point. I want to get to that. Manik, why don't you address that for a minute?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, appreciate that, Dave. I think the quality of capital and the source of the capital has changed a lot as well. When we see the kinds of investors in the private capital markets that are now involved with climate tech, these are long-term minded, deep-pocketed, patient sources of capital. A quarter or an immediate crisis, if anything, reinforces a fundamental bet that this energy transition is necessary. Energy security is part of the story now and not just sustainability. And so we're seeing huge funds that have lots of capital taking a 10, 20-year horizon on these investments. I think they're actually more excited about what's happening around the innovation economy and trying to invest in companies. I think the interest has actually increased. There might be a shift in valuation. That's a quarter by quarter or month by month type of thing. There's obviously a lot of inflationary pressure and there's a lot of other headwinds, but generally there's way more patient, long-term capital, human and financial. And the human capital is the other piece of it. People want to work in this space. And so as long as people think this crisis is looming and needs to be solved, what happens on the news cycle is only reinforcing that urgency.
That's a very good point. And if anything, the energy crisis going on in Europe has led to an acceleration of calls for an expansion into renewables. And we'll see if they can come through on that. Sarah, what are you seeing?
Well, I'm a baby entrepreneur. This is my first go around. Sorry, I'm a baby entrepreneur. This is my first go around. But one of the things I'm learning as I go around is that capital is conservative, even when it claims to be risk taking, and even when it's meant to be passionate about saving the world, it's still very conservative. And for any startup company to say, we're going to be the future world, we're going to represent the way the world needs to look, they still have to present a conservative case for how they can survive until the rest of the world is suddenly motivated to catch up with them. And that's still a gap that all of the bright words and promises of investors still has to struggle to keep up with. That some of the change we need to invest in is in companies that still look like too much like the future and needs a concerted group effort to make enough of those other companies and motivations around so that they can actually spark the change. I don't know how to answer that. I know that we're seeing more and more people willing to take more and more risks, but capital is conservative, and that's what scares me, is it's still too conservative for us to keep up.
Maddie, have you seen that with your company?
I mean, when you're raising venture funding for a tree company, yeah, it's hard. I think overall we're a climate change biotech company, and the investors that believed in us were ones that I think saw that future that you so aptly described and agreed with the hypotheses that we had at a high level, that land was changing so quickly, areas were becoming degraded, and that science, in the same way that it's helped for crop yield, could help with climate change. So I think there are actually more investors that used to be traditional software investors that are getting comfortable with hard science and getting smart about hard science. And a lot of that has to do with early commercial traction that they see from large company partners. So even if X investor doesn't know very much about like capturing carbon off the back of trucks, if a lot of companies they know and trust very well have committed to doing that, then all of a sudden that investment becomes potentially viable or interesting to them.
Good points. Good points. Avida?
Well, and I was just going to add, I think where we've been really focused, because I agree, I think that the venture capital community, it takes a while, and especially with new entrants learning about and how the market is evolving and how the capital community is evolving. It's just, and in the current context, difficult in general. But so where we're really focused is customers and go to market. And so following up on Heather's comment, during the last administration, there was a lot of activity at the state level that made environmental justice and actual investments in reducing emissions in communities a mandate. And that has translated into a national mandate. And there are state level dollars, federal dollars. So we're very, very focused on that market. And then I think The other opportunity is in the energy sector, where you're seeing a lot of investments in transition and transition related activities that are creating massive opportunities for companies that can support that transition. And so I think it's for us, how does the current moment really open up massive markets for our technology to support those efforts to reduce emissions and protect public health?
And getting back to what you were saying earlier, Heather, about that, the money already being there. We hear, those of us in the media, we're constantly looking for the next big thing, and Biden's climate agenda is falling off a cliff, Joe Manchin, all this stuff. But you made a very good point. The infrastructure bill was passed. There's money going in. There's money flowing in. Are you, to Davida's point, are you starting to see those flows, and is it flowing equitably?
So yes, it's starting to flow. We have a lot of work to do on equity, and it's the reason why this conversation is so important, is because the more we talk about it, the more I think we are normalizing what it means to be equitable. There are some really good examples that are out there. The work that Davida is doing, we've seen that firsthand. And I work very closely with mayors. So mayors are looking at it. They see the dollars that are coming into their communities, and they need to be able to use these data points to leverage this. We at EDF look at this information as well to see how we can assist, ensure that there is the best data and science and economic policy that's put to it. But it comes down to the local level, the entrepreneurship. One of my favorite companies is an elemental company, Charger Help. It's one of my absolute favorites because it solves a basic problem. Looking at the fact that we're deploying EV across this country, there are billions of dollars that have been set aside for this. But what happens when it goes down? Who fixes it? Who comes out and goes to the Whole Foods Mart or McDonald's and actually fixes the EV station? Well, Charger Help specifically looked at that one problem and looked at it in a way that I believe is really equitable, because more often than not, the places it goes down first are low income and under marginalized communities. So what help does that give us if you finally get low income communities to embrace EV, but when they go to plug it up, their system is down? Charger Help solves that. That's how we become more inclusive around equity and understanding what that means, and understanding what a just transition means. And the money is out there now to do that.
That's a really good example. And one of the major knocks on EVs is that the charging stations are always down wherever you go and you look for them. It's a really good example. Mia, you touched on this subject in the previous session when you were talking about how to channel that optimism and that capital flow into in more equitable local. And we were talking a little more international. You were talking about Africa, for instance. Are we starting to see any of that happening? Has it been affected by the geopolitics of the last few months? I saw the Biden budget plan had almost $12 billion in it for international, which I hope is going to be targeted towards countries that need it most. But what are you seeing in that respect?
Yeah. So one of the things that the team that I work on is small but mighty, and we're a relatively new firm in terms of Lowercarbon and its current incorporation. But we, I think, understand that in order to invest in climate, you need to invest outside of the United States and outside of the West and the global North, and increasingly are starting to make investments in companies. Not all of them are fully public yet, but companies operating on the ground in those areas. I think that there's a tremendous gap, both in private as well as public capital, serving emerging economies. And when you have, there was a commitment made on behalf of developed countries for, I think, $100 billion in support for adaptation and resilience in developing economies that was never made good on, right, as part of one of the COP agreements. And I think there is an onus on the developed countries and on the economies that are going to be benefiting from, frankly, the returns on investment in some of the companies that will take off to also think about how, from a public investment standpoint, and especially in adaptation and resilience, we are investing in economies that will need support there. And so I think there's a gap on the private side. I think there's a gap on the public side.
And time is running out.
Yes.
Mentioned with Molly.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Manik, you were saying?
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly right. There's gaps on both the public and private side. And I think there are times when technology and risk capital can be an equalizer and can help create some of the diffusion curve that you need to see in developing economies. The company I run, Therma, works on refrigeration and cooling, which turns out there are refrigerators and air conditioners everywhere in the world. And it's growing at 33x by the end of the century, and it's already responsible for a big source of emissions. Everyone wants cooling because people want food and pharmaceuticals and vaccines and air conditioning. So we're working on using risk capital from Silicon Valley, some of the best, brightest, and most thoughtful investors, but our tech is deployed in 12 countries. We want to deploy it in 100 countries. And a lot of that can help reduce emissions in the long tail, where a lot of the growth in these problems is happening. If everyone had the same amount of refrigeration and air conditioning that we have in California, we'd be talking about 11% of all global warming caused by cooling. So, that math doesn't square. But I think risk capital, though it's concentrated in pockets like New York, London, Tokyo, here, can actually be used to create innovation that can then be diffused elsewhere. And that's one way to create equalization.
Part of the responsibility is to bring those technologies down the cost curve and make those upfront investments such that we're building things that ultimately can be economically feasible in lower income parts of the world.
You guys seeing that too at Avra?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've realized very much a place-based investor, and started in Hawaii, grew to California, and now have a global portfolio. And exactly right. We're trying to help our portfolio companies really do first-of-a-kind projects in the field, right? So what we see across our portfolio is that there's iteration that happens after the first launch to really understand how to deploy at scale, right? So there might be a new market, there might be a new customer, there might be a tweak to the product. This is all learning that happens after that first deployment and enables the cost curve to go down and the scale to take off. It's not just you launch and you're done, right? It's like you launch, you learn, you iterate, and then are ready to scale. And of course, there will always be some local nuances, or often be some local nuances and tailoring and considerations, but it's about really figuring out that product market fit and what the right path to scale is. And so we're seeing that has been a trajectory over the course of our 130 portfolio companies, but also as we look to new investments, right? And we have our 11th cohort is open now for applications, and what we're seeing is an increasing number of global companies in our portfolio and in our applicant base.
That's fantastic. That's really what we need to see. James, you spoke at the beginning about the SEC's new climate disclosure rules, or at least proposed climate disclosure rules. They face a lot of legal challenges, of course, but it seems that we're moving all over the world towards improved disclosure regulations, and that we will see something from the SEC when this is done. My own feeling is that they are pretty confident they can get most of it through, if not all of it, but we will see. Talk a little bit about the rise of that part of the climate solutions business, the risk disclosure, the advanced climate intelligence, and data and disclosure. How does that kind of feed or fuel the entrepreneurs behind the solutions?
That's a really good question. So when we take a look at the proposal, when we look at the calculation of scope 1 and 2 being that initial requirement, and scope 1 again is the direct use of the assets that is owned by a company and emissions that's generated from that. And scope 2 is the consumption from the utility grid. When we talk about a lot of the things that needs to take place within this environment, investors are finally realizing, I don't think it's finally realizing, I think investors are now pushing that climate risk is truly a financial risk. When you look at what's taking place in Ukraine, you take a look at the prices of gases. If you understand now in your scope 3, or your business is dependent upon these type of fuels, this is now a risk and a shock test to your actual price, right? Did a customer consume this price, or did your bottom line then get hit by it? So now given that, I think what we're going to see from a reporting standpoint is, as the SEC is working through these proposals, companies, regardless because of investors' pressure, is going to start reporting. And once a company starts reporting, you're not going to stop. And at this point, you have over 73% of companies that's producing some type of report already. And now that we're going to have regulation to do it, I don't think that you're going to see a a pullback from that. From a data standpoint, the data that we're collecting from what companies are, what's taking place in the environment for where companies are generating emissions and what their supply chain looks like and emissions that's getting generated from there, that data will then drive the markets to what solutions need to be created to then help with that transition risk. And also you have companies looking at physical risk analysis of where do you have your assets located? And based on natural disasters that's going to take place due to different climate scenarios, what does that actually mean? And then someone talked about earlier about the resiliency of the buildings and what does that need to happen from an economy standpoint. So this data that's generated from companies being mandated to report is going to drive how we look at the supply chain, how we analyze the supply chain, what technologies we need to have in place to then help with that energy transition, et cetera. So I think it's going to be that, in the presentation I talked about, is really going to be that baseline to give investors and companies that analysis where you're going to see new markets get generated from this data alone. And then on top of that, when you look at the when you look at the offset market, that's going to be one of the biggest commodity trading markets that we have. And the data is going to be needed to drive those markets to understand the quality of the offsets, the regulations that's going to have to come to make sure that those offsets are actually removing from the air, or they're true offsets and they're not something that's really not offsetting, but more greenwashing in nature. So I think, as other people have talked about, this is truly a global issue. And to understand where investments need to take place or the technology that's going to be needed, you're going to need that underlying data from companies to be able to do that.
And we could do a whole another panel or conference on offsets. But last question on that: do you see this? Does the world need standardized climate disclosure regulations, or will we end up, as a lot of this comes together, Europe and the U.S., kind of being more of a guidance type of thing?
It goes back to financial accounting, and standards actually generate and create markets. If you don't have standards or confidence in the data that you're getting, you can't really build a market on it. You really can't make decisions on it. And so when we look at climate accounting now, where you have the GHG protocol as that baseline, if someone disagrees with the protocol and then come up with their own calculation for how to do it, that's very problematic, right? So think about that from a company's perspective. If I'm not able to read the financial statements of a company because I'm not sure what calculation or metric they use, how do I once know if I can compare it? How do I also know if I have true risks or not? And so really, when you look at climate risk as a financial risk, in order to have transparency, generate markets for investors to be able to make true allocations of capital, you need to have standards and guidelines. And we know they're not going to be perfect, but that's where the iterations start. And you have to start now with what we have. And then as more people are actually building around these standards, you have more audit and insurance that is taking place. Then you'll start seeing new standards on top of the GHG protocol, such as PCAP, Partner for Carbon Accounting and Financials, that's generated. I believe you're going to have that across multiple industries, where it will be more specific to that industry, so that when you see their statements or guidance, you can make better analysis in regards to the data you're looking at.
Good
I would
stuff.
just like plus one that,
Sure.
just plus one, James, looking at our entrepreneurs and our ecosystem, like having a market is really powerful, right? It's yet another, especially the companies that are working on carbon capture, carbon negative materials, having a clear market that they can participate in is game changing. They have other revenue streams. But it's again, the cost curve, it's a long road. And so this is really, truly, in a lot of ways, really important for the the entrepreneurs who are trying to find ways to build their business, frankly.
I have one more thing to that. If it's not standardized also, and you don't have this practice around it, then what takes place is, think about that from a company perspective, that have to then figure out, how do I do the accounting? You think about the confusion that will cause, and actually the additional capital they would have to expense to do it all differently. And so actually by standardizing it, it reduces the cost to actually do this at scale. By not standardizing it, it actually increases the cost to be able to report back to investors, because you're all trying to use different solutions.
Davida, you were trying to say something?
I mean, I was just going to compliment what you were saying, because we are seeing boards of major companies already responding to the SEC rules and wanting to get ahead of this and saying, actually, we don't understand our actual emissions. These are major, major emitters, right? And there is, just to get wonky for a minute, there's some concerns, right? And as standards evolve, this will evolve and change. But emissions factors are what are used to calculate, to do this accounting. Those emissions factors are not necessarily based on direct measurements of emissions. So there is a gap. We know, for example, going back to methane, that there's a massive gap between what we think the methane emissions are and what the emissions coming out of the Permian Basin actually are, for example. And so we're already seeing boards who have a fiduciary get ahead of this and say, come in, please generate measurements. We need data to understand how to improve our operations, because once you start reporting, there is pressure to improve, right? Measure what you manage. Emissions have forever been an externality. What these kinds of rules do is that they turn them into an internal cost and an internal risk that you manage as part of doing business, which is what it should be.
Go ahead, Manik. Then I want to get to audience questions.
Just want to add on the front lines. I mean, we're selling products right now to companies like Marriott, McDonald's, Now Foods, Wyndham, Hilton. And when we talk to C-suites, they want to know, who am I selling this to internally? Is this a financial decision that the CFO should be thinking about? Is this an operating decision that we should be thinking about from a sustainability as part of bottom line? Is there a reporting metric around our net zero commits? So just to where the rubber meets the road, when companies are thinking about buying technology or adding services that improve their sustainability, I think excellent points, James and others, when you have standards and when those standards are both trusted and shared by many people, it makes it a lot easier for quicker decision-making, faster adoption of new solutions. People can then make decisions around the risk around that, as well as around the investments long-term. It just speeds up the whole process and also allows a lot more players to get in on it. So SEC and public sector, SEC and public company innovation is driving downstream innovation across smaller companies as well, and making it possible for newer players like ours and many of the folks here building companies to actually play and scale faster. So it's great to see it. Awesome points.
All right, I've got a bunch more questions, but we're running out of time, so I want to make sure you guys can ask any questions if you want. Is there anything from the audience yet? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Nicholas, Berkeley MBA student. My question is, coming from Brazil, I'm very interested in local solutions. They are the big AI software engineer heavy solutions that will come from Silicon Valley, Europe, whatever. But what are the local solutions that, as investors, you're interested in seeing coming from developing countries?
Who wants to take that one?
Well, so first off, I don't know that there's necessarily a delineation. Like, I don't know that all of the innovation in, for example, software or innovative approaches to energy markets, for example, and finding ways to make it easier to scale renewable capacity and to deliver that energy to customers is necessarily going to come from the Bay Area. And I think we're seeing an innovation across the globe in those models, because they are necessarily very tailored to kind of the regulatory and the environments that they come out of. And so we've looked at many companies across geographies that are finding ways to innovate within the context of their local regulatory and kind of market environments, particularly on energy, and particularly when it comes to increasing penetrations of renewables on the grid, and finding ways to make that available to consumers, and kind of navigate the complexity of the ecosystem there. So I think there interesting solutions exist across use cases. And one of the most exciting things about climate, someone said recently, referred to Lowercarbon as a niche investor, which I thought was pretty hilarious, because anytime I give the pitch of what Lowercarbon invests in, I'm like, we invest in climate solutions. We think of those in 3 big categories: emissions reduction, carbon removal, and buying more time for communities and ecosystems. That first bucket includes solutions across all sectors of the global economy. It is literally everything. These are the largest addressable markets in existence. And the size of the solution set is massive, because the size of the problem is massive. And so I think that, the most interesting solutions are the ones that exist kind of at the intersections of industries, and that layer on the specific local context.
All right, any other questions? Okay, I got a couple more. We still got a few minutes. We've heard all day about these really exciting, different types of solutions. And it's so it's easy to become an optimist when you come to a conference like this and you hear this stuff. And the tree biotech, I love the idea. And some of the stuff that Bill Gross was showing us early on. You guys are all pros. You're either running your own companies or investing in companies. Give me in just a short sentence, so I can hit each one of you in the next 2 minutes. What technology and or company gets you most excited? Malik, let's start with you.
I mean, it's hard not to plug your own.
You can't pick your own company.
It's like, is that a rule?
You can't pick your own company.
It's like the only thing I think about
Just
these
what's
days.
cool.
Sorry.
For instance, there's a company here that's using drones to fight wildfires. I think that's really cool.
That is really cool. I love, I'm really fascinated by these kind of moonshot ideas that people are investing in now. I think I'm very excited about the ecosystem around carbon sequestration. Some of these companies that are now actually creating carbon removal from the atmosphere.
Okay.
2 Icelandic firms. I won't go down carbon sequestration, but I think that's part of the solution set. Like
Heather?
companies that are.
I mentioned Charge of Help already, but something I'm really excited about is we announced today, actually, a partnership that EDF has with the African American Mayors Association. So we've developed a fellowship program where we're actually working alongside mayors of color in communities that are hardest hit to develop these solutions together. I'm thrilled about that and excited that we're doing that.
Fabulous. Congrats. Sarah?
I'm a big fan of companies that are founded around a question of an assumption that ended up not being true, but that everybody had. So I'm going to plug some of my favorite, some of my cousins from Activate Cyclotron Road. I love Feasible. I love Gradient.
Fabulous.
Those are great companies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another cyclotron road company that's in the Lowercarbon portfolio I've been kind of nerding out about recently is Antora Energy. I think, again, the really interesting solutions are the ones, and the ones that are kind of unique to the climate ecosystem are ones that sit at the intersection of two massive opportunities. And Antora is at the intersection of industrial heat decarbonization and potential long duration storage on a utility scale. So I also have a microphone.
Avra.
That's interesting. I know. How do I do this? I'm really excited by some of the innovation in circular economy, especially taking waste and turning it into carbon negative materials. There's a company called Made of Air that functionalizes biochar for industrial use. It can be used for buildings. It can be used for products. It can be used for sunglasses.
I know them. That's a really cool company.
It's a really cool company. So, and there's a lot of innovation in.
Are you investors in them?
They're an elemental company.
All
yeah.
right. James?
The whole ecosystem around the data that we actually need in order to do calculations at scale. So there's companies that are working with, pulling data from smart meters where you can ingest that data, understand the carbon footprint in real time, and then be able to adjust that. And then going back to carbon removals, I think that's going to be key to actually being able to, to be able to transition towards net, or to get to net zero. We have to be able to figure that out from a technology standpoint.
All right. Maddie?
I'm really excited about the idea of highly integrated carbon farms. So what I mean by that are different project developers or different technologies actually working together to maximize the carbon that you can capture per acre land, right? So a direct air capture plant that also has trees near it, that's also being used as a site of bio-oil injection. All of these different organizations can really make a big difference, not only in carbon removal, but in removing emissions for hard to abate industries.
Great one. And we did not talk enough about agriculture today. Next time.
My favorite, well, I have many, but one of my favorites is actually run by Donnell Baird. He runs a company called Block Power, and he's addressing one of the biggest, probably unsexiest part of the climate problem. 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are from buildings. And so he is mobilizing gigantic workforces and new financing strategies to decarbonize buildings in communities hardest hit by pollution and low-income communities, and also creating an incredible workforce development program to actually train people up on how to do this in their communities. He recently got the city of Ithaca to commit to decarbonization at scale across the entire city on a very aggressive timeline. So love with Donnell.
That is fabulous. Well, thank you all for your ideas and your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Wish we had more time. Thank you all. I'm sure you can see everybody afterwards.